Welcome to Learn and Love Music. I'm Duane Hulbert. Today we're going to look at an early Beethoven sonata, his Opus 2 number 3. It's a great piece. It's in C major, it's brilliant, and has a lot of light technique in it. A little different than what you would expect from a late Beethoven sonata. But this piece is difficult. There are a lot of things that you have to know about how to work on fingering with this. I'm going to give you 6 tips on how to play this piece. All of these passages that I'm going to demonstrate have a lot of light technique in them, and this is what's really important for these early works of Beethoven. Before we get started though, I want to encourage all of you to subscribe to our channel. I want to see you back again, so let's dig into this great piece by Beethoven. By the way, he was only 25 years old. Very early Beethoven piece. Let's get started. Tip number 1. How to play these double thirds at the very beginning of the sonata. We know that later Chopin wrote an etude in double thirds, and of course Liszt did a lot of pieces with double thirds. Double thirds, or thirds, are hard to play because they involve repeating notes over and over and over, and sometimes you can get tied up in knots. It gets kind of mushy. But what I find is, rather than using the fingering that's used in the book here, this is a Henley edition. They have 4, and they have 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1. But I always find that when I'm working with these fingers here, the third finger always gets stuck. So what I do is, to relax my hand, I use kind of a really different kind of fingering. On the first 2 notes, I play C, middle C with the thumb, and the E above it with the 5th finger. So I'm not even using these middle fingers at all. But when you start playing fast, you'll do 2, 4, 1, 5, 2, 4, 1, 5, 2, 4, 1. And as you go faster, it works a lot better than doing 1, 3, 2, 4, which is a little more mushy when you do it that way. But the reason you want to do that is, in this beginning, it has to be crisp, light, and really technically clean. Tip number 2. In measure 15, at the very beginning of the piece, Beethoven throws in a lot of octaves in sixteenths, and they kind of go stepwise down the scale. But they're rather difficult because you have to control the octaves with some sort of I call it like a move, or I always think it's like a dancer or a ballet dancer moving through the line beautifully. The one thing about the piano is, if you don't move your wrist at all, things get really, really stiff. What I do is I create a clockwise line. In other words, I'm going up this way, and then if I do the notes here going down in measure 15, I do down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. If I just left out the top note, I do down, up, 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 down. But you add the top voices. It's really important to have that variety in the touch, especially since those notes are repeated. So we go E, D, D again. That repeated note really gives you problems because you have to have a different motion for the first note than the second one. Down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. And as you go faster, it gets much lighter, and that up note gets much, much lighter too. Down, up, down, up, down. I always tell students when they're working on something like this not to be heavy with the up motion. It's heavy, but just use that really light touch with a little accent on the note on the beat, and then keep the other one much, much lighter. Remember, the softer and the faster you go, that's going to be the really difficult technique to learn with a piece like this. So try to use that flexible wrist when playing this passage. Tip number 3. In this passage of measure 67, we have also more of these broken chords, but now the sforzandos come every 2 beats. So there's a 4-note group. 1 group, 2 groups, 3, and it happens 4 times. Beethoven repeated a lot of his motives in this piece, and this is a perfect example of that. But when you're working in the technique, you want to make sure that that sforzando goes down and the other notes kind of float forward. So if I do it with both hands, down, float, float. And that's difficult to do, but slow practice. The other thing that I do with this passage is I use a counterclockwise motion. Down, around, down, up, down. And that's really important to keep the sforzandos separate from the non-sforzando notes in this passage. Remember, this is an early Beethoven sonata. A lot of the technique has to be extremely light in touch. Tip number 4, how to play broken octaves. In measure 85, we have broken octaves in both hands. One of the things that I find important is to try to find a place in the passage where you're not putting all of your energy in. It's difficult because Beethoven writes fortissimo here, but really the best way to do it is to show a little bit more of the fortissimo on the downbeats and then let the notes in between the downbeats be much lighter, even though it's marked fortissimo. So if I did it slowly, it would be like this. Downbeat, lighter, downbeat. So at speed, it's practically impossible to play that all fortissimo. But if you give it kind of a shape, you can find you will be able to develop much more speed. If I do it up to speed, it's always impressive if you can start a little bit less, and then as you build toward the end, make it a little more powerful. On a modern piano, it's very difficult to sustain a 4 or 5 measure technique like that at the fortissimo level. I think it's more important to give it some shape, give it some shading, not all loud as Beethoven wrote. Tip number 5, how to play octave leaps in measure 123. Here's what Beethoven does. He starts out with a staccato note, and then he has a sforzando that follows, and then a phrase off, short, long. One of the things I find helpful in working on a passage like this, if you have a lighter note, as we have with this D flat, don't just play it downward, play it up, and it prepares you for the sforzando that follows. So it's up, down, phrase, up, down, phrase, up, down, phrase, short, short. And if we do both hands, the left hand would be doing this. Short, short, long. So you do them all together slowly. Left hand down, right hand up. Right hand down, left hand up. Right hand, left hand, right hand, left hand. And by the way, at the end, even though they're marked sforzando, I do them as a big push-off. I find that that's better than doing it's too heavy. I like the push-off better. So let's put that all together, and I'll sort of talk you through it. Left hand, sforzando, right hand. Push. So much of technique involves how you're using your hands, and the most important thing is to learn how to use both the down motion and the up motion to make these kinds of passages work for you. And finally, number 6. This is a cadenza passage for Beethoven. Doesn't happen too often in his works, but it's a great way to learn how to play really fast technique. Here he doesn't even put bar lines in. He just puts a lot of 16th notes up the scale, and it's sort of alternating. And what I do with most passages like this for students is to learn how to play rhythms. So if I did this, held the first note, and then went fast to the next one. And the interesting thing about this passage is the entire passage should be played with the same fingering. So 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1. But like the other passages, we want to develop that with rhythms. The rhythms would be, hold the first note, fast. We've got the next 4. And they have to be extremely light. And then you can start doing 2 groups at a time. So you do think. And in the end, it's most important that you follow Beethoven's markings, forte piano. So the big chord comes in, this. It's such a fun passage to play, but the key is light touch and consistent fingering. Thanks for watching Learn and Love Music this week. Make sure you check out our companion video where I'll be playing all of this first movement of Beethoven Opus 2 number 3. We'll see you next time on Learn and Love Music. I'm Duane Hulbert.